I was 15, my friend Kaido and I decided to do something dumb and thrilling after a horror movie marathon. There was a demolition site a few blocks from his house, a whole row of battered houses the city planned to tear down in a couple of days. Chain link fences, spray-painted warnings, "Do now intar," and plywood nailed over every window and door. It had that lonely, forgotten smell a place gets before it disappears entirely. We were buzzed on adrenaline and teenage bravado. Kato swore he knew a weak point in the fence where you could slip through if you ducked low enough. The plan was simple: sneak onto the lot, take some eerie photos, laugh later, and leave before any real trouble arrived. We took a cheap point and shoot and a couple of flashlights and walked the lot under a thin moon. Everything about the place screamed abandonment: peeling paint, sagging porches, the metallic tang of old nails. We stuck to the shadows, laughing too loud to sound brave. The house at the far end had most of its openings nailed tight, except for one upstairs window where a rotten plank had been hammered and crooked. From the sidewalk, you could just see a narrow slice of the room inside. Kato balanced on a low fence and aimed the camera up at that small gap. The flash popped and washed the boards in hard white. For the two of us, the sound seemed obscenely loud in the hush, like a confession. We high-fived and shuffled back to the car, still buzzing. I didn't expect anything to come of it. It was a prank against the world and a souvenir for our boredom. At Kaido's house, we dumped the photos onto his laptop and scrolled through them, voices soft and smug. There were frames of broken shingles, graffiti, a sagging curtain, ordinary trash. Then, suddenly, the screen stopped me cold. In the window frame, where, in the dark of the lot, there had been nothing, stood a woman. She wore a brown raincoat, buttoned up tight, hair pitch black and long enough to pool at her shoulders. Her skin was shocking in its pallor, like paper dipped in milk. She wasn't smiling, not at all. Her face read as a long, slow ache, sad hollow, like someone who'd been waiting at a doorway for a very long time. Kaido and I both swore we hadn't seen anyone when we took the picture. The boards had been nailed from the outside, the door had been sealed. In the faint light on the lot, there had been no movement, no shadow slipping away, no sound of whispering. Yet there she was in the imagey still, turned slightly downward, eyes that seemed to hold another room of darkness inside them. We tried every rational explanation. Camera artifact, reflection, a trick of the flash, maybe a neighbor walked past at the exact wrong moment, an unlucky alignment of the world. I wanted to believe it was that easy. But curiosity wouldn't leave us alone. The next night we went back, this time quieter, trying not to sound like kids who'd already been caught by their own fear. The fence pressed close and smelled of metal and wet grass. We crept to the same house and trained our flashlights on the boards. Everything looked exactly as before. Planks hammered tight, a sagging curtain in the corner of a room, a bed frame collapsed into shadow. We climbed down and tapped the boards. Heavy, nailed in, sealed. No hollow where a human could hide. No footprints in the dust on the windowsill. No sign anyone had been inside for years. Still, the photograph did not make any logical sense. When the demolition crews rolled in 2 days later with their orange vests and big machines, the neighborhood gathered like a small, uncomfortable audience. Men with clipboards pried off planks and opened the upstairs window wide. The room revealed itself to be empty and cold. Old newspapers, a rotten mattress, nothing living. The workers tossed the boards aside and joked about rats and insulation. There was no trace of a person having stood at that window the night we'd photographed it. Afterward, whispers gathered speed like leaves in a gutter. An elderly shopkeeper down the road muttered about a tenancy that had ended poorly. Someone who'd been forgotten during a frantic move. A woman who'd waited at the window for a return that never came. Another neighbor mentioned funeral records and a name the city had stripped from its phone book. It felt like people were trying to give a story where none had been properly told. Kato and I kept the photograph like contraband, an artifact that didn't quite belong to daylight. We showed it privately to a couple of friends, the kind of sharing that feels like daring someone to believe. Sometimes, late at night, I'd look at the woman's face and imagine the scene that might have placed her there, a quiet grief, a weathered raincoat, someone who expected company and received only silence. Years later, I still get a small, almost foolish chill when I pass an empty lot or a boarded house. I think about how easily the world forgets the rooms it vacates, how things, people, grief, memory, can be left behind like loose nails. Whether the photograph captured a trick of light or a broken place of waiting, I never managed to shrug it off. Every time I think of that pale face in the upper window, I hear the soft click of a shutter and feel for a second that we looked at something we weren't meant to see, and that it kept looking back. When I was in college, I worked late most evenings at the library. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid for books and gave me a quiet place to study once my shift was over. The library sat at the far end of campus, right by a cluster of old lecture halls that hardly anyone used after dark. By the time I left, the paths were usually empty, just pools of orange light from the lamps and long stretches of shadow between them. One night in November, the air had that sharp bite of oncoming winter. I'd stayed later than usual, finishing a paper, and when I finally stepped outside, it felt like the whole campus was asleep. My footsteps echoed too loudly against the pavement, the kind of sound that makes you check over your shoulder without even thinking. Halfway down the path, I noticed her. A girl about my age, maybe younger, standing just outside the reach of a lamppost's light. She wore a thin hoodie even though the night was freezing, and her hair fell forward so I couldn't see her face clearly. At first I was relieved. Another student walking home, but something about the way she stood there, too still, too quiet, made me hesitate. "Hey, you okay?" I asked, my voice carrying farther than I meant. She lifted her head slowly. Her face was pale, almost gray in the lamplight, and her eyes looked glassy, unfocused. She didn't answer, just turned and started walking down the path ahead of me. Her steps made no sound. I followed at a cautious distance. The campus paths twisted between lecture halls, but she never glanced back, never sped up or slowed down. Just that same steady, silent pace. When she passed under the next lamppost, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. Her shadow never appeared on the ground. Mine stretched long and thin under the light, but the space around her feet stayed empty. I stopped walking. For a second, the night felt too big, too silent. Then curiosity pushed me forward again. I told myself maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe my tired brain was inventing shapes where there were none. She led me toward one of the oldest halls on campus, a tall brick building with boarded windows and a heavy set of locked doors. No one had used it in years. She slipped around the side of it, into a narrow alley where the lamplight couldn't reach. Against every ounce of good judgment, I followed. The alley smelled of damp brick and leaves left to rot. My phone screen barely lit the way. At the far end, she stood with her back to me, facing the wall as though waiting for something. "Do you need help?" I asked, softer this time. She turned. Her face was clearer now, eyes wide and hollow, mouth opening as though to speak, but no sound came out. Then, before my brain could process what I was seeing, she stepped backward into the wall, not around it, into it. Her whole body sank into the brick like it was water, until the alley was empty except for me and the sound of my own breathing. I froze, staring at the wall. My rational mind scrambled for answers. Maybe there was a hidden door, maybe my eyes had blurred the moment. But the bricks were solid and unbroken, worn smooth with age. I bolted out of that alley and didn't stop running until I was back in my dorm room with the door locked. The next day I asked around, casually at first. Most people laughed it off, but one older security guard gave me a look I won't forget. He said that decades ago, a freshman had gone missing on her way back from the library. Last seen walking near that same hall, they never found her. Students whispered that her spirit still wandered campus after dark, trying to find her way home. I never worked that late shift again. Even now, years later, whenever I walk past that old hall, I feel the urge to look down that alley. But I don't. I'm afraid of what I might see, or worse, what might see me. Back when I was living downtown in a busy US city, I had a habit of taking long, late-night walks. I've always been more of a night owl, and since my roommate wasn't, I'd head out when the city grew quiet. For nearly 4 years I walked that way, and not once did I ever feel unsafe. In fact, I used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers in the city seemed polite. But that sense of security shattered one night, all because of one man. It was a Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 a.m. The streets were unusually still, even for midweek. I was looping back toward my apartment, cutting through a quieter side street that led past a police-patrolled park. The park was deserted, no joggers, no late-night wanderers, just the hum of the city far off in the distance. That's when I first noticed him. At the far end of the block, standing under the dim glow of a streetlight, was a man. At first glance, it seemed like he was dancing. His movements were strange, almost like a slow, exaggerated waltz, except with each stride forward, he would nod his head in a sharp, unsettling motion. He was moving straight toward me, yet his steps had this unnatural grace, like he wasn't just walking but performing. I remember thinking he must have been drunk. That was the only explanation my brain could process. To give him space, I edged toward the curb, leaving most of the sidewalk free. But the closer he came, the more details I could make out, and the less this looked like a drunk man. He was tall, unnervingly thin, and dressed in an old, outdated suit. And then I saw his face. His head tilted slightly back, eyes wide and unblinking, staring off at the night sky. And his mouth was stretched into this horrifically wide grin, so unnatural it looked almost painted on. That smile wasn't warm, wasn't goofy, wasn't drunk. It was wrong. My chest tightened, and instinct took over. I crossed the empty street quickly, glancing back to make sure he just kept walking by. But when I looked, he wasn't dancing anymore. He had stopped. He was standing perfectly parallel to me across the street, one foot in the gutter, his body still facing forward but his head tilted back, eyes still skyward, that awful smile plastered across his face. He hadn't even looked at me, but it felt like he had me pinned in place. I tried to keep calm, keep moving, but every step felt heavy. When I looked back again, he was gone. Relief hit me like a wave. For a few seconds I thought maybe I'd overreacted. But then I spotted him again. He was crouched low now across the street in the shadows. He was facing me. I had looked away for maybe 10 seconds, and in that time he had silently crossed the street. My stomach dropped. There was no way someone could move that fast, not without me hearing it. I froze, my eyes locked on him, and then he started moving again. This time he didn't dance. He crept, his knees bent, his arms dangling loosely, and his steps exaggerated like some cartoon villain tiptoeing across the floor. But he was fast, far too fast. My entire body screamed at me to run, to do something, anything. But I couldn't. I was rooted in place, terror flooding through me. He crept closer, then suddenly stopped, just a car's length away. That grin, those wide, crazed eyes, looking past me as if I were nothing but air, but somehow knowing exactly where I was. Finally, my voice broke free. I wanted to shout, to demand what he wanted, but what came out was a whimper.
What the f...
He didn't move. Didn't react. Just stood there, smiling, staring up into the sky as if he hadn't heard me at all. And then, slowly, almost gracefully, he turned his body around. He began to dance again, that same eerie waltz step, gliding down the street away from me. I should have run. I should have taken that chance. But I couldn't turn my back. I just stood there, watching him fade into the distance. Relief trickled in until I realized he wasn't fading. He wasn't getting smaller. He was getting bigger. He was coming back. This time he wasn't dancing. He was running, sprinting toward me with that same impossible smile. That was the moment my body finally listened. I ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, tearing down the side street and onto a better, lit main road. My chest burned. My legs felt like they'd give out, but I didn't stop. I looked over my shoulder, and he was gone. For the rest of the walk home, I expected to see him. In every shadow, every alley, every dark doorway, I braced for that smile. But he never appeared again. I stayed in that city for 6 more months. But I never walked alone at night again. Not once. Because that smile, that horrible, unnatural smile, it wasn't the look of someone drunk or high. It was the look of someone completely, utterly insane. A few years ago, I picked up some work cleaning houses to make extra cash. It was usually simple stuff: sweeping, dusting, mopping. Nothing weird. But there was one farmhouse job I'll never forget. The owner was a quiet man in his late 50s who called me one afternoon. He sounded polite, if a little nervous, and said he needed his old family home cleaned before putting it up for sale. He offered me double my usual rate if I could do it alone. That should have been my first red flag. When I arrived, the place was exactly what you'd picture: a creaky two-story farmhouse, isolated, with overgrown fields all around. The inside smelled stale like dust and mildew. The man gave me a short tour, explained he'd be gone for the day, and left me with the keys. At first, it was nothing unusual: vacuuming old carpets, scrubbing the kitchen counters. But when I got upstairs, I found a small bedroom that was different. The door had 3 heavy locks, all undone but hanging there like someone really wanted it sealed at one point. Inside, the walls were covered in scratches. Not little marks, deep grooves, like someone had been clawing to get out. I tried to shrug it off, but as I vacuumed, I realized the floor had strange dark stains. They weren't normal spills. They looked soaked in. I was already unsettled when I heard it, a knock, not from the front door, not from outside, from inside the locked bedroom closet. My blood froze. I stood there, listening. And then it came again, a soft, deliberate knock, 3 times. I wanted to leave, but stupid curiosity made me call out, "Hello, nothing." Silence. I told myself maybe it was the house settling, maybe a raccoon or some trapped animal. But when I reached for the closet knob, my phone suddenly buzzed in my pocket. It was the homeowner. "Don't open the closet," he said immediately. His voice was flat, serious. I stammered, asking why. There was a long pause. Then he said, "Just finish the rest of the rooms and leave that one locked. Please." My hands were shaking. I wanted to get out, but something in his voice kept me there. Against every instinct, I obeyed. I backed away, locked the bedroom door again, and hurried downstairs. I cleaned the rest of the house as quickly as I could, heart pounding the whole time. I kept expecting to hear footsteps upstairs or see the closet door swing open. But the house stayed silent. When I finally left, I looked back at the farmhouse one last time. In the upstairs window of that bedroom, I swear I saw movement. Just the faint outline of someone standing there, watching me leave. The man paid me in cash later that week. I asked about the room, but he brushed it off, saying it was just bad memories, and he didn't want to talk about it. I quit cleaning houses not long after that. Some money just isn't worth it. Back in college, I picked up babysitting gigs to help cover rent. Most families were kind, the kids easy enough to handle. But one Saturday night, I got a call that still gives me chills when I think about it. A couple I barely knew asked if I could watch their 2 children, Emma, 7, and Caleb, 5. They lived in a large house at the edge of town, surrounded by woods. When I arrived, the parents were already dressed for a night out, eager to leave. They gave me quick instructions: dinner was in the fridge, bedtime by 9, and then rushed off. The kids were sweet, though a little quiet. We had pizza, played a board game, and by bedtime, I tucked them in with no issues. That's when things started feeling wrong. As I read Emma a story, she whispered, "Don't let him in." I laughed nervously, asking what she meant. She just shook her head and hid under the covers. After they were asleep, I settled on the couch with my phone. Around 10:30, I heard it, the creak of the back door. I froze. At first, I thought maybe the wind had pushed it open. But when I checked, the door was still locked. Relieved, I turned back toward the living room, and that's when I noticed muddy footprints across the floor. They weren't there before. They led from the back door, straight toward the staircase. My heart pounded. I grabbed the phone, ready to dial 911, when Emma's voice called softly from upstairs. "He's in the house." I raced up to the kids' room, but they were both curled in bed, wide-eyed and shaking. Caleb whispered, "He comes when Mom and Dad aren't here." Trying not to panic, I locked their door, pushed a dresser in front of it, and called the police. As I spoke to the dispatcher, I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, like someone taking their time. Then a man's voice, low and mocking, "Babysitter." I nearly dropped the phone. The dispatcher kept me calm, saying officers were on the way. I held the kids close as the footsteps stopped right outside the bedroom. The doorknob rattled violently. The man whispered again, "Open up." I pressed my back against the dresser, praying it would hold. Minutes felt like hours, but eventually I heard sirens. The rattling stopped. By the time the police stormed in, the intruder was gone. No forced entry, no broken locks, just those muddy footprints that ended at the staircase. The parents returned home shaken and confused. They claimed nothing like this had ever happened before, but Emma just stared at me and whispered, "Told you." I never babysat again after that night. Some jobs are too dangerous, no matter how much you need the money. It was a freezing winter night, and I was heading back to my dorm after visiting a friend. The last bus had already left, so I had no choice but to wait at a nearly deserted stop on the edge of campus. The streetlights flickered, the air stung my face, and the silence was heavy. I wasn't alone, though. A woman stood at the far end of the bench, dressed in a thin gray coat that didn't match the weather. Her hair was long, stringy, and hung over her face, and she never looked up. At first, I didn't think much of it. People kept to themselves all the time. But the longer I waited, the stranger it felt. She didn't move. Not a single shift of weight, not even her breath showing in the cold air. It was like she was frozen there. I pulled out my phone, scrolling just to distract myself. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed she had turned slightly, her head angled toward me. Not much, just enough that I could feel her attention. My chest tightened. Finally, I broke the silence. "Cold night, huh?" No response. She just stood there. A bus approached in the distance. Relief washed over me. Finally, I could get out of this eerie situation. But as the headlights drew closer, the woman suddenly whispered. It was so faint I almost missed it. "Don't get on." I blinked, unsure I heard right. "Sorry, what?" she repeated, louder this time, her voice flat and unnatural. "Don't get on." My stomach dropped. The bus pulled up, doors hissing open. The driver leaned out, gesturing for me to board. I hesitated, the woman's words echoing in my head. Against every bit of logic, I stepped back and shook my head. The bus pulled away, disappearing into the snowy night. For a moment, I wondered if I'd just made the dumbest decision of my life. But then, less than a minute later, the sound of screeching tires and a deafening crash tore through the silence. I sprinted down the road, and there it was, the same bus, smashed against a jackknife truck, windows shattered, smoke rising into the cold night. When I turned back toward the stop, the woman was gone. No footprints in the snow, nothing. Just empty air where she'd been standing. I don't know if she was real, or something else entirely, but I know this: if I had stepped onto that bus, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Grew up in a small rural town, surrounded by endless fields and thick woods. When I was about 16, I used to walk home from a part-time job at a convenience store. It wasn't too far, maybe a mile, but it meant passing through a lonely stretch of forest that most people avoided after dark. One night, my shift ended later than usual. The path was quiet except for the crunch of my boots and the occasional hoot of an owl. I had my earbuds in, trying to ignore how uneasy the trees made me feel when I heard a voice. At first, I thought it was part of the song I was listening to, but when I pulled the earbuds out, I realized it was coming from deeper in the woods. "Help, please." It was faint, shaky, like someone crying. My gut twisted. Every horror story I'd ever read screamed at me to keep walking. But what if someone really needed help? I stood there frozen, torn between fear and guilt. The voice came again, this time closer. "Please, I'm lost. Help me." I forced myself to call out. "Hello, where are you?" I waited, straining to listen. Then a twig snapped, not far off the path. My heart started pounding as I took a step back. The air suddenly felt heavier, colder. Another whisper drifted out. "Come here." That was enough for me. Every hair on my body stood up. I bolted down the trail, running so hard my lungs burned. I didn't stop until I reached the first streetlight near the edge of town. When I turned back, the woods were silent again. Nothing moved. The next morning, I told a friend what happened. His face went pale, and he told me a story I'll never forget. Years earlier, a man had been found dead in those woods, strangled after being lured in by someone pretending to be in distress. Locals said the killer was never caught, and some believed his spirit still lingered, tricking people into following that same voice. I still walk that path sometimes, but never after dark, and whenever the wind moves through those trees, I swear I hear faint whispers calling my name. It was a Thursday evening after basketball practice. The gym still smelled of sweat and floor polish, and the squeak of my sneakers echoed as I crossed the polished court. Most of my teammates had already left for home, their laughter and shouts fading as the heavy doors slammed shut behind them. I stayed behind to gather my things. I wasn't in any hurry. The locker room felt different the moment I walked in. The air was sharp, cold, like stepping into a refrigerator, even though it was late spring and the rest of the building was warm. The fluorescent lights above flickered in that annoying way, buzzing faintly. My eyes swept across the rows of lockers, and I froze. Almost every single door was slightly open, just an inch or two wide enough to notice, but not enough to look intentional. I muttered under my breath. Weird janitor must have forgotten to lock up. I tried to shake it off. I dropped my gym bag on the bench and bent down to retie my shoelaces. That's when I heard it, a low creak, like a metal hinge straining. I looked up quickly. One of the locker doors at the far end had moved, just a little. I blinked, telling myself it was my imagination. But then, another one, and another. The sound spread down the row like a wave. Slam, slam, slam. Locker doors, closing one by one, alternating from left to right. My chest tightened. "Hello," I called, my voice cracking. No answer. Just the sound of lockers slamming shut on their own. I stood up slowly, trying not to make noise, my pulse racing so loud in my ears it almost drowned out the sound of metal slamming. By the time the last locker banged shut, the echo was deafening. Then silence. I told myself I had to get out of there. I yanked my bag off the bench and started walking fast toward the exit. Halfway there, I heard something else, faint footsteps behind me. Not heavy like a teammate's, but slow, deliberate. I whipped around. Nothing. The rows of lockers stretched back in silence. But I could swear I'd felt the vibration of someone stepping on the tiles. "Coach," I called out, louder this time. The word seemed to die in the cold air. The lights flickered again, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow move along the far wall. My mouth went dry. I didn't wait to see more. I sprinted out, nearly tripping as I shoved the heavy metal door open, not even checking if I had everything in my bag. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that echo of lockers slamming shut one after another. The next day at school, I pulled aside my friend Daniel, one of my teammates, and told him what had happened. I expected him to laugh, but instead, his face went pale. "You don't know?" he asked. "Know what?" He lowered his voice. A couple years back, a senior collapsed during late night practice. Heart failure. He didn't make it. They said it happened in the locker room. I stared at him, my skin prickling. "Some players say he never really left," Daniel went on. "Lights flickering, lockers slamming, sometimes footsteps when no one's there." I wanted to call it superstition, just ghost stories passed around the team. But deep down, I couldn't shake what I'd felt: the cold air, the footsteps, the slamming doors. After that night, I never stayed late alone again. I finished practice, packed up quickly, and left with the others. Because in the back of my mind, I always remembered that cold, echoing silence after the last locker shut, and I knew whatever was in there with me that night didn't want me staying. It was a chilly evening in late autumn, and my wife and I had just returned from a quiet dinner downtown. The neighborhood was unusually quiet for a Friday night. Streetlights flickered as we approached our home, and I immediately noticed something that made my stomach drop. The front door was slightly ajar. I froze for a moment, my mind racing. "Stay here," I whispered to my wife, trying to keep my voice calm while my pulse hammered in my chest. She nodded, gripping my arm tightly as I slowly stepped inside. Every step felt deliberate, as if making a sound could alert someone lurking in the shadows. The house was silent, too silent. I crept through the living room and then up the stairs, my eyes scanning every corner. I headed straight for the bedroom where I kept my shotgun. It was a habit from living in a neighborhood where break-ins weren't uncommon. As I grabbed the weapon, my hands were shaking, but I felt a strange mixture of fear and focus. I scanned each room as I went, empty. Living room, kitchen, office, even the basement. Nothing. No sign of forced entry, nothing out of place. My wife's eyes were wide with fear, and she whispered that she hadn't touched the door. I called the police immediately. When they arrived, they walked through the house with me, inspecting every inch. Upstairs, downstairs, the basement, nothing. No footprints, no open windows, nothing missing. I was starting to doubt myself. Had I really left the door open? Then a scream. My wife's voice pierced the silence, and my heart nearly stopped. She was staring at the closet in our bedroom. My blood ran cold as I realized I hadn't checked every hiding spot. Slowly, I turned toward the closet and caught the briefest glimpse of a face peeking from behind the door, a stranger's face, wild-eyed and pale. I raised the shotgun, cocked it back, and shouted at the intruder to come out. For a moment there was silence. Then, as if realizing he had been caught, he bolted. My adrenaline spiked, but I didn't fire. He ran straight for the front door. Within seconds, he vanished into the night. The police were furious we hadn't detained him, but they admitted there wasn't much they could do after he had escaped. They speculated he was scouting the house and left quickly after being discovered. We were shaken but unharmed, and strangely, nothing had been taken. In the weeks that followed, my wife and I were hyper-aware of every sound. Doors that clicked, creaking floors, even the wind brushing against the house made us jump. Friends and family visited, and we became overly cautious, triple-checking locks and setting multiple alarms every night. It was months later, when I found out from a neighbor, that our neighborhood had been targeted by a serial burglar who avoided taking valuables, simply terrorizing families. They were never caught. Every time I think back to that night, I remember the chilling sight of that man's face in the closet and the way he had disappeared, as if he belonged to the shadows themselves. Even now, years later, I can't shake that feeling of being watched whenever I'm alone in the house. The memory is vivid, the quiet, the sudden scream, and that brief, terrifying moment when I realized someone had been inside, just feet away from where we slept. It was a stark reminder that safety is often an illusion, and fear can strike even in the most familiar places. About a year ago, when I was still living under my parents' roof, I began experiencing some strange and unsettling events in my bedroom. At first, I tried to dismiss them as mere coincidences or my imagination running wild, but over several nights, the occurrences became impossible to ignore. One late night, I lay awake in bed when I heard a slow, deliberate creaking sound coming from across the room. My heart skipped a beat as I realized it was my closet door. It had somehow opened on its own. I sat up, tense, and instinctively checked inside. Of course, there was nobody there. I tried to calm myself, rationalizing that perhaps it had been the wind or a faulty hinge. I shut the door and attempted to go back to sleep. Later that same night, another strange noise startled me. This time it was a low, rattling sound emanating from above the ceiling. It sounded almost like something moving through the air ducts. I felt uneasy, but the noise stopped after a while, and I eventually managed to drift off. In the morning, I mentioned the strange sounds to my father, but he brushed it off, saying I must have been too tired or imagining things. The following night, it happened again. I lay awake, dreading the familiar creak. Sure enough, the closet door began to slowly swing open, as if someone were nudging it. This time, I was genuinely frightened. I scanned the closet carefully, even though there was no possible place for someone to hide. I told myself it must be a mechanical issue, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As the night progressed, I heard that same rattling sound above the ceiling again. It was exactly like the previous night, but this time, something felt different. A sense of dread settled over me. I reached for my bedside lamp and shone it toward the air vent in my room, and then I saw it two wide, open eyes staring straight through the vent at me. I screamed. My parents rushed into the room, alarmed by my terrified cry. I tried to explain, pointing to the vent and insisting that someone or something was inside. They exchanged concerned but skeptical looks, assuming I was either dreaming or overreacting from being too tired. Despite their reassurances, I knew I hadn't imagined it. The eyes had been too real, too deliberate. The next few nights continued in the same terrifying pattern. The closet door would slowly open on its own, the rattling from above would echo through the room, and I would find those same wide eyes peering at me from the vent. Every night, my fear grew, and I began dreading bedtime. I slept fitfully, half awake, constantly listening for the faintest sound. I considered moving my bed or even sleeping in the living room, but nothing seemed to escape the sense of being watched. I couldn't explain the phenomena. The house had never shown any signs of a break-in, and my parents insisted there was no logical explanation. Yet every night, I was confronted by the same horrifying presence. Eventually, I took extra precautions, checking the locks, securing the windows, and placing a chair in front of the closet door. None of it seemed to matter. The events continued, unwavering. The eyes were always there, silent and unblinking, a reminder that someone or something had infiltrated my personal space without my knowledge. Looking back, the experience was unnerving, not only because of the direct threat I felt, but also because it defied all logical explanations. I've never been a believer in the paranormal, but this experience forced me to confront the possibility that some things exist beyond our understanding. Those 3 nights remain some of the most terrifying I've ever experienced. Even now, years later, I occasionally feel a shiver when I pass an air vent or hear a creak in the house. The memory of those eyes, wide, unblinking, and impossibly close, is etched into my mind. I can still recall the way they seemed to study me, as if measuring my fear, knowing that I was aware of their presence, but powerless to confront it. It's a haunting reminder that some threats aren't physical, some are psychological, invisible, and terrifyingly intimate. Those nights in my room were a brutal lesson in fear, leaving a lingering impression that I will never forget.